Hey, welcome back to part 2 of my History of Crete series. Last episode we covered everything from the very foundation of the island hundreds of millions of years ago to the end of the rule of Alexander's generals, and today we're going to be covering everything up until the Ottoman conquest of the island. So let's get started. When the Romans first tried to conquer the island, they were soundly defeated. However, following a brutal 3-year-long campaign and an addition of 3 entire legions being used, they ultimately came to rule the island starting in around 69 BC. Nice. Well, actually, not really. That sounds terrible. On the surface, Roman occupation was a mixed bag for Crete. On the one hand, you had being heavily taxed and not being heavily prioritized by the Roman leadership. Yet, Rome offered a continuation of widespread trade, travel, in addition to the infrastructural advancements and stability that the Diadochi, or Alexander's generals, simply never matched. And while the widespread of this concept of Roman peace, so to speak, is often highly exaggerated by some writers, in the case of Crete, it's actually pretty spot on. So with this level of long-standing peace only ever really being rivaled by 7,000 years of the Minoans, it was a pretty decent time for many on the island. Not everyone, though, obviously, and there are some problems that we'll get to about that, such as, for example, a main thing disrupting this peace was the widespread use of slavery in the Roman Empire, which, needless to say, made it quite impossible for many Cretans who were especially a victim of that system to actually partake or enjoy in this relatively calm political context. And obviously many Cretans would become victims themselves to the truly evil institution of slavery within the Roman Empire. For the majority of Roman rule, the language and religion remained relatively unchanged by the Romans, with the locals mostly speaking Greek and following the Hellenic pantheon. However, this would change around 50 AD when a certain St. Paul sailed to Crete. Spoiler alert, the faith he preached would quickly replace the previous Hellenic faith institutions in only a few hundred years. In fact, there's actually a chapel where he supposedly landed to celebrate the event. The church here at Agios Pavlos isn't particularly grand or large, but I'd argue its beautiful location more than makes up for it. During the transition of central power from Rome to Constantinople, starting what we would now call the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire, Crete remained as it did during the later Roman times. It was still a relatively peaceful yet deprioritized province with so little acknowledgement that in the case of regionally prominent events like the First Council of Nicaea, for example, even when smaller islands like Kos, which is Crete is more than 28 times larger than it, so a significantly smaller island, even that island sent bishops, but there were no representatives at the council that were from Crete. Over this period, there were 4 major earthquakes noted in the historical records. These include the earthquakes of 365, 415, 448, and 531. While not as catastrophic as the Thera eruption, they played a hand in the decline of the Minoan rule for sure, and these quakes were still devastating, but not nearly to that extent, destroying many long-standing buildings and killing hundreds if not thousands. While arguably it took longer than it should to rebuild after this tectonic period due to the insignificant central government support financially, the hundreds of years of governmental deprioritization did leave the island vulnerable. Unlike when previously Crete was effectively in the middle of a one-state lake when the Romans were in power, during the Byzantine eras, they're now sharing the Mediterranean coastline with several other powers. And you can probably imagine how that turned out. And by 824, after several raids, a coalition of Arab pirates conquered the island, forming the Emirate of Crete, which would prove to be a major thorn in the side of the Byzantines, at least in the Aegean region, all the way up until its reconquest by Constantinople in 960, after 130 years after it was originally lost. Over the following 244 years, Crete became more integrated into the standard Byzantine governmental systems upon its reconquest, but following the significant decline in holdings over many years, Crete was actually briefly sold by the Byzantines to an incredibly wealthy crusader, who they themselves then quickly turned around and sold the very land they literally just bought to the Republic of Venice, thus separating Crete from the other Aegean islands in the sort of broader Byzantine Greek sphere yet again in 1204. For over 60 years before Venice officially even took over the control of the island, Venetian traders, through several treaties with the Byzantine emperors, were granted several tax exemptions. So thus, when the Venetian state managed to purchase Crete in 1204, the Venetians already were well economically established on the island. In addition to the traders already there, Venice would also send several waves of colonists that would receive free land forcefully stolen from the Cretans, of course, in exchange for military service, which was pretty devious. This thus was increasing their control over the locals on two fronts, land and arms. And in total, around 10,000 Venetians from a home city population at the time of only 60,000 would make their home on Crete. They made a new city around the ruins of Kydonia in the northwest corner of Crete that they called Canea. Nowadays we call it Hania. In fact, it was one of the most popular tourist spots in all of Crete nowadays is in Hania, and it has the very unsettled title of the Venetian port. I'm sure you can guess who built it. Of course, the locals were not particularly happy having their land and wealth stolen from them by force, and this resulted in a plethora of revolts. A short list includes the years of 1212, 1219, 1222, 1228, 1262, 1272, 1282, 1303, 1319, 1333, 1341, 1363, 1364, and 1523. And no, I didn't misspeak when I said that's the short list, because there's actually over 20 in total, and I did not list 20. So clearly the Venetian era wasn't all about ports and trade. Venetian rule was heavily resisted by the people of Crete, needless to say. And as it turns out, being a brutal colonizer doesn't exactly win you any favor with the people who call the land home. And over all of these revolts, it's interesting to see just how often they're channeled through Byzantine and Orthodox power structures specifically. So like, for example, the very first result was partially started by the Venetians expropriating property of the Orthodox Church on Crete, which then led the church to openly aid and side with the rebels. Again, in the 1262 uprising, that was started directly by a Byzantine emperor sending a contact to the island to meet with Cretan nobles and to get them to revolt, and it was also supported again heavily by the Orthodox clergy. Yet again, in the 1282 revolt, the Byzantine emperor encouraged the resistance fighters, and Orthodox monasteries became actually commonly used bases and hospitals for the rebels. So, as you can tell, most of the uprisings used the Byzantine Empire and Orthodox Church as their sort of foundation stone, so to speak, for each attempted revolt. While they ultimately failed to gain long-term independence, it didn't mean Venice's profits and control of the island was set in stone, as quickly, one by one, from the 1450s to the 1570s, all Venetian colonies in the eastern Mediterranean were lost to the new and rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire. After the loss of Cyprus to them in 1571, Crete was pretty much the only major Venetian colony left in the region, actually. I mean, can you imagine how tense of a time this must have been for the people of Crete? You've been stuck under the rule from these people, the Venetians, who have fought to disempower your very faith and language, take your money, and abuse you for over 350 plus years. There's been over 20 unsuccessful attempts to kick them out for good, and now there's this even larger empire who isn't exactly predisposed to empowering Greek communities and giving them freedom, who, by the way, are poised to defeat the very colonial state that you've been trying to break free from and take you over themselves. The Cretans are hopelessly outgunned, yet genuinely have little to no incentive to want even so much as an alliance with either power, let alone outright annexation, which is the only thing either state has on the table as an offer. And so yeah, that's where we're going to end part 2. Next time in the final episode, I'll be doing my best to cover the period of Ottoman rule over Crete, the absolute hell of chaos in the late 1800s and 1900s after that, as well as some post-1974 history on the island after the very infamous military dictatorship in Greece was overthrown. So yeah, love you all and take care.